Hey everyone, welcome back to another video here on DarkSec. I am Dark, and today we're going to be taking a look at the Intro to Windows room. Now, this is a nice primer on the history and then understanding some of the higher concepts of Windows itself. This isn't necessarily going to teach you to use the operating system, it's going to teach you to start becoming a power user and how to understand things like group policy and things like that. So, with that being said, let's go ahead and dive right in to Task 1, a little history. Windows history. On November 20th, 1985, Microsoft announced its operating system named Windows, which was a graphical operating system shell as a response to the growing GUI's graphical user interfaces. At the moment, Windows dominates the world of computers with around 90% market share, and it overtook Apple with Mac OS, which was introduced in 1984. So we have several Windows versions. This does not include servers. They're right down here. So you Windows 1, 2, 2X, and so on and so forth, up to modern day, which is 10, and then a lot of people run 7, which you shouldn't be because it's deprecated, and so is 8. Don't run 8. It is a terrible operating system, and if you're running this, you either have a really good reason for it, or you shouldn't be. The Windows Server versions, not too many of those. Windows Server, predominantly you're going to see this Windows Server 2019 out in the wild now, along with Windows Server 2016. Occasionally you'll see Windows Server 2012 and 2012 R2, primarily R2 of this, just because that's the updated version. If you see that in the wild, I believe 2012 is deprecated, so that's not something that you want to see. These newer ones, they look like Windows 10, just in server flavor, if you ever see them. All right, read a little bit about Windows history and versions. We've done that. When was Windows announced? That was November, if I can spell, November 20th, 1985. Press enter. What is the latest version of Windows? That is going to be Windows 10. As of the time of writing for this room, I'm sure that we will probably get something. I'm guessing it's going to be a continual service delivery model for Windows in a few years. Which is the latest version of Windows Server, Windows Server 2019. All right, let's go into Task 2, Windows File System and Permissions Explained. What is the file system? It is the method and data structure that an operating system uses to keep track of files on a disk or partition. Without a file system, the information saved in a storage media would only be one large body of data with no way to tell where the information begins and ends. Think of it this way. It's like the Dewey Decimal System in a library. Similar to how Linux has its distinct file system, this is used as a standard for what's stored where, and it establishes order on the actual disk. Windows file system structure is, so you have the logical drives rather. So for example, your base disk is always going to be C. This used to be A, I want to say, on a different operating system. Then it was B, and then C is Windows. There is a historical reason for this, and I definitely recommend Googling that. It's actually a really interesting story if I could remember it, but I digress. Folders, these are the actual folders that come by default. So for example, the documents, your downloads, and then your music. And then you have the actual files, so the actual data itself. Something that might also interest you would be the folders located on the C drive and their role. These folders are perf logs, program files x86. This is x64 technically right here for the one that doesn't have this x86. Users, and then Windows. Let me break down and explain each of them. Perf logs stores the system issues and other reports regarding performance. So think of it as just performance logs. That essentially is what it is. Program files and program files x86 is the location where programs install unless you change their path. Typically you want the default path, and this isn't something that you're really going to deviate from. It is easier if you install them in this default location. If you get a bunch of games, it's usually better to have a different drive that you can let Steam and Origin and everything else take over, and then you just let that live over there, and then Windows lives on your C drive. So for example, choosing to install software in the D drive or something like that, or in a network drivers, things like that. Users, in this folder are stored the you have your user profiles here. This is where your individual like downloads and desktop and all those folders. Yeah, your desktop is just a folder on the file system, even though it has an actual display component to it. It's just another folder. That's where that's all saved. Windows, this is the folder that contains the code to run the operating system and some utility tools. Typically, you're not going to touch this folder ever. It's interesting for, I believe, binary purposes, and that's about it. So, file permissions. File permissions can be set by an administrator or a privileged account. These permissions can be applied to users and groups. You can also do this on files that you own. So if you create something, you can change the permissions on it to let other people read it. Permissions that can be set are full control, modify, read and execute, list folders content, read, write, and then special permissions. Now, one thing to note, these are very similar for the most part to the Linux file system permissions. So you have the 3-number combo that you can modify using chmod. Very, very similar to this, except it's just more verbose and you have a GUI for it. It's just a little pop-up that looks an awful lot like this, that just lets you change these things. And these are pretty straightforward. I'm not going to go through what these explicitly do. The only one that's really interesting is the special permissions, which gets into, I believe, shadow copies and some other stuff. So you can do like different backups, differential backups. So whenever you change a file, it saves a diff between the two. So whatever the difference is, it records that. That's something that you can change in the permissions and or the properties, I believe. And that's about it. Everything else is very straightforward, especially if you've done the Learn Linux rooms or Linux fundamentals. This is something that you'll find pretty second nature at this point. As you can see, users can only read, execute, and list the folder's contents. So in this specific case, however, we want to allow them, and here we go, you can see that actually right there. There we go. However, we want them to be able to store, edit, or delete files inside that folder. To do that, check the modify box. You will see that by checking the modify box, the write box will automatically be checked too, because writing is a form of modifying. And you can see that down here. So checking one checks write. To apply the changes, click apply over here. The reason we do not set the full control permission on the folder is that users could set permissions and take ownership of the folder themselves without the action of an administrator or privileged user. So if they have full control over their folder, they can lock you out. A tool you can use to check the files or folder permissions is iCackles. This is something that is included in Windows by default. Super, super helpful. This is really nice for if you are doing cyber defense competitions and you need to check and make sure that files are able to be read by the correct users and only those correct users and groups. Very helpful for checking the permissions on your flags, helpful for checking the binaries that you have on the system. You don't want to have other, users be able to write two binaries that they can run as an administrator or runs as a different user. That's a problem. So you can see with running iCackles on this important folder, we can see the properties of that folder, and we get a whole bunch of this just alphabet soup over on the right hand side. You can see that that is actually the permissions that we have per each group. And in this specific case, you can see that they're grouped together just a little bit in the order that we see down here too. So let's walk through those real quick. So first we have I, which is the permission inherited from the parent container. Very easy to remember. I for inherited. F, you get full access. Very straightforward. M for modify. OI, object inherit. IO, inherit only. Container inherit, so it inherits from the container that it's in. Read and execute, again, the same as having the read and execute bits set in Linux. Append data, add subdirectories, so if you can actually add things in that directory or add directories furthermore. And then WD, which is write data and add files. You can use iCackles to check permissions, set ownership of the folder, set, remove, or deny permissions as well. An example would be setting the ownership of the folder to users. So for example, if we wanted to, and this is something that I wouldn't recommend playing around with iCackles too much for this purpose, we could use it to set the permissions of the important folder. so that the owner is the users, or the specific user is named users. Very strange way to go about that. Yeah, you can see that this looks like a group in this specific case. So once again, we can use iCackles to set or change the permissions, very similar to chmod and chown, or chown rather, in Linux. If you go to the properties and then click the security tab and then click on advanced, you can see the properties as well, and we have a little screenshot of that below. Let's go ahead and mark that as completed, and then let's see. In which folder are user profiles stored? This is an easy one. That is going to be users, and there we go. Let's move on to task 3, understanding the authentication process. And this is a bit of a long one. We're going to walk through how Kerberos works, which is something that, if it doesn't make sense the first time, don't worry about it. Kerberos is a little tricky. Even the talks that I've been to by Tim Medine from Red Siege, he will talk about Kerberosing, and he will explain at the start of every talk, for the most part, how Kerberos actually works. It is a multi-step process, and it is complicated. Don't worry too much if it goes whoosh. This is something that I would recommend. Play around with it, come back to this video, listen to the explanation again, and then go back and play around with it again. It makes more sense in practice. All right, so task 3, understanding the authentication process. What is authentication? Authentication is a process for verifying the identity of a person or an object or a service. When you authenticate a person, the goal is to verify that person is not an imposter. Authentication is you are who you say you are. Another topic that, or another phrase rather, or word that gets confused with authentication is authorization. Authorization, similar core idea, but it's you can do what you claim that you should be able to do, authorizing actions. So authentication, you are who you say you are. Authorization is you can do what you say you should be able to do. Local authentication. Local authentication is done using the Local System Authority, LSA. LSA is a protected subsystem that keeps track of the security policies and the accounts that are on a computer system. It also maintains information about all aspects of local security on a computer. So this is your authentication service on the computer. LSAS is something that you're going to want to look into a little bit more. It's specifically, if you were familiar with Mimikatz, that is the service that we are attacking with that. Whenever you log into your computer, you need to be able to authenticate to things continuously, and Windows isn't going to keep asking you for your password. LSAS actually holds your password in memory, and that's problematic because we can just, dump that. There are ways to protect it, but it's good to know what this is, as it's a core thing that you're going to be attacking when you are hacking on Windows. Types of Active Directory. So there's 2 types of Active Directory, and one of them has become much more prevalent in the recent years just with the shift to cloud. So first we have on-premise Active Directory. This is your classic AD. This is you have a domain controller on site or on your premises, hopefully multiple of them, just so you know you have backups, and everything is just servers either running here or you can have them out in the cloud, but it is a dedicated machine. You can also use Microsoft's solution to this, which is Azure Active Directory. This is if you want to use Microsoft's cloud service, so rather than using something like AWS or Google Cloud or DigitalOcean or something like that, you can use Azure's specific Active Directory because Microsoft has it all set up for you, and it makes it actually pretty easy. So good to know that there are 2 types. Again, on-premise isn't necessarily meaning that you have all the computers there. They can be in the cloud too, but you're not using Azure. Authentication on on-premise Active Directory. So on-premise Active Directory has a record of all users, PCs, and servers, and authenticates the user signing in via network logon. So once signed in, so once you've actually logged into your, so for example, you're going to work and you signed into your work computer, Active Directory also governs what users are and are not allowed to do or access different things. So it's going to tell you, what you can actually access, different network drives that are actually mapped to your computer, and so on and so forth. In an on-premise Active Directory environment, the authentication can be made by using the following protocols. So you have NTLM, LDAP, or LDAP-S, which is LDAP Secure, and then there's Kerberos. First, let's talk about NTLM and NTLM v2. NTLM uses a challenge response sequence of messages between a client and a server system. NTLM provides authentication based on a challenge response authentication scheme. Try saying that 10 times fast. It does not provide data integrity or data confidentiality protection for the authenticated network connection. In other words, NTLM v1, bad. Don't use it. That's actually how you can get tools like Responder that will just make a pen test very, very easy. You can oftentimes just get a, hey, I won, from using Responder. If you're not familiar with Responder, that's something that I do recommend taking a look at. I believe the room Attactive Directory goes over it, and I think Throwback also covers it a little bit as well. Attactive Directory, I think, is another free room, so definitely recommend checking that out. Here you can see we have the server that provides a challenge, and you have to respond to it. It essentially is doing some magical, mystical things with your password that it's able to say. It doesn't. The goal is that it's not sending your password over the network. It sends a hash of your password over the network, which Microsoft, in their infinite wisdom, decided that, you know what? Hey, we don't want to send user passwords over the network. That's a good idea. That is genuinely a good idea. However, all you need to authenticate to something is a valid password hash. In this specific case, that leads to things like pass the hash attacks. That is something that is further covered in Throwback, I believe specifically. Definitely recommend taking a look into that. Very interesting topic, but you can see where you have attacks like that arise from, the idea of doing something really good. And it just creates a weakness just because it's not necessarily well thought out. LDAP and LDAP-S. The main difference between LDAP and LDAP-S is that LDAP-S supports encryption, and therefore the credentials are not sent in plain text across the network. Yeah, ideally you don't want to have your password on the network, because it's, even though the idea of having an attacker just sitting on your network and, just listening to things may sound distant or like something that you don't think could ever happen, oftentimes it's not just an attacker that actually records these things. You can have things like your SIM or your monitoring instance on your network that might be collecting logs of things like this, and your password might just be in a log, and that's a problem. So things like that happen. Another thing to keep in mind is that the domain controller, the DC, can be considered a database of users, groups, computers, and so on, and then it contains the information about those objects. Using LDAP or LDAP-S, the user's workstation sends the credentials using an API to the domain controller, again, the DC, in order to validate them and be able to log in. Here you can see that we've got the simplified diagram below. So you've got the actual computer that you're logging in with. This is going to be your workstation. This looks an awful lot like a Mac. Typically, you can use LDAP on a Mac. Typically, this is going to be done with a Windows computer, though. So that rather unfortunate image for the diagram. But you can see that we're using LDAP, sending our credentials, getting an authorized request. It's coming back and we're asking the server, hey, I want to log in. And the Active Directory server says, hold on, let me check your password. And like the DMV, it takes a moment. And then it comes back and says, hey, okay, cool, you can log in. Or it tells you, what are you doing? You try again with your password, bud. Maybe it's a Monday morning and you forgot your password over the weekend. So very simple response system in that. Kerberos. Okay. This gets a little complicated. This is something that I do recommend watching Tim Medin's talk on this. If you go to Red Siege's website and look at their presentations, I believe Tim has a recording of this that is up on YouTube. It may not make a lot of sense at first, but it's something that I definitely recommend being, one, familiar with, and two, digging into further as you get into your hacking career. So another way to authenticate is using Kerberos, named after the three-headed dog that guards the gates of hell. Often depicted either very, very fiercely in Microsoft documentation or as a small puppy with three heads. Uh, you can get a mixed bag with this one. Kerberos uses symmetric key cryptography and requires trusted third-party authorization to verify the user identities. What does that actually mean? Whenever you request the access to a resource on the network, you get a ticket to it. Think of that ticket as like one to get on a ride at an amusement park. Your ticket is valid and you have to show it to the server, and the server says, okay, cool, you can do what you want to do, but you need to get that ticket first. I won't go into the specifics here just because this is a little bit beyond the scope of the room in this case. Again, I recommend checking out that talk from Tim Medine. Just know that this is a back and forth series that eventually get issued a ticket that allows you to authenticate to different things. And you use that to get service tickets and other things like that so that you can use different things on the network. Authentication on Azure Active Directory. Azure Active Directory is a secure online authentication store which can contain users and groups. Users have a username and password which are used when you sign into an application that uses Azure Active Directory for authentication. That is a mouthful. So, for example, all of the Microsoft Cloud services use Azure Active Directory for authentication. So, O365, Dynamic 365, Azure, so on and so forth. What does that mean? You have auth up in the cloud. You have a mystical, magical domain controller that sits out in Azure that has a really nice GUI on it. Azure, I haven't used a ton personally. It is not that different from what I've seen from AWS and other things like that. Does have some unique quirks from what I'm aware, but think of it this way. Authentication up in the cloud, really, really helpful right now, especially with a bunch of users working from home. You may not be able to authenticate easily to your work network, and being able to authenticate to something that's out in the cloud, much easier. So this can be really, really nice, and this is actually where a lot of companies are going. So knowing how to do some Azure hacking is definitely something that I recommend learning. Not necessarily immediately, but further on. Azure Active Directory supports the following authentication methods. So you have SAML, which is Security Assertion Markup Language. You don't need to know what that stands for. OAuth 2.0. OAuth you will come across a lot. And then OpenID Connect. Let's talk about SAML. So Security Assertion Markup Language, SAML, is a type of single sign-on standard. That means, so SSO means you sign in once, you don't have to log in again. The idea behind this is that you log into your computer and then your browser can use your Kerberos ticket to pass through authentication. It will do the authentication for you magically behind the scenes. It defines a set of rules / protocols that allow users to access web applications with a single login. This is possible because those applications, referred to as service providers, all trust the systems that verify user identities, referred to as identity providers. This is a good thing to know, specifically service providers and identity providers. So service providers, these are the systems and applications that users access throughout the day. For example, Citrix, it would be considered a service provider. And then identity providers, this would be the system that performs user authentication. All right, let's talk about OAuth 2. OAuth 2.0 is a standard that apps use to provide client applications with access. So the OAuth 2.0 spec has 4 independent roles. The authorization server, which is a server that issues the access token. The resource owner, normally your application's end user, that grants permission to access the resource server with an application token. You have the client, which is the application that requests the access token and then passes it to the resource server. And then the resource server, which accepts the access token and must verify that it is valid. In this case, this is your application. All right, this was a lot. You don't need to know this necessarily as you're getting started. You will need to know this primarily when you are getting into web app hacking. OAuth isn't always implemented the correct way. So OAuth is done in part with a token. Sometimes OAuth is just not implemented really at all. And when you log in, it's just checking to see that you have an OAuth token, not even a valid one. And I hope that everyone can see where that might be an issue. So again, you don't necessarily need to know this. This is something that I recommend being familiar with. Again, security is exposure based, so knowing about something is half the battle because you can go back and research it further as you need it. Let's talk about OpenID Connect. So OpenID Connect is an authentication standard built on top of OAuth 2.0. It adds an additional token called an ID token. For that, it uses simple JSON web tokens, so JWTs. You will want to know what these are, especially with doing web hacking. These are often implemented very poorly too. While OAuth 2.0 is about resource access and sharing, OIDC is all about user authentication. All right, so read the above. Let's go ahead and mark that as complete. Which Active Directory is cloud-based? That's going to be Azure Active Directory. And again, if this all sounds just very whoosh over your head, don't worry too much. This is just things to be familiar with on your path to becoming more of a power user on Windows. Which authentication method does not provide data integrity? That's going to be NTLM. Depending on that, I believe NTLM v3 actually does some encryption and might do data integrity. Generally speaking, you don't want to see older implementations of this. Their NTLM or LM landman not encrypted very well and very easy to crack. Not good. Very not good. Which authentication method that assigns a ticket in order for a user to log on? We talked about this quite a bit. That is going to be Kerberos, again, our good old three-headed dog, guarding the gates of hell, otherwise known as a Windows domain. Which authentication method allows users to access applications with a single login, so SSO? This can be done with multiple of them, but in this case, the question is looking for SAML. Authentication method that uses JSON web tokens, that is going to be OpenID Connect. All right, let's jump into task 4, utility tools. All right, built-in utility tools. Windows comes with a variety of utility tools. Some of them are computer management, local security policy. That is going to be similar to GPO that we'll talk about a little bit at the end. Disk cleanup, you've probably used that before, especially if you've installed a new hard drive in your computer. Registry editor, hopefully you haven't used that before. Registry editor is one of those tools that you should use if you need it and know exactly what you're doing with it. It's very easy to break things with that. Command line tools, and then registry editor in the form of regedit. I think that might be a duplicate on that list. So yeah, again, regedit. This is one that we'll talk about it a little bit here, but again, avoid this unless you need to do something very specific with it. So let's break down each of them and see their usage and why they're important. So first, let's talk about computer management. Computer management contains more tools such as Task Scheduler, super useful. Also great if you want to have a backdoor scheduled that way. Event Viewer, useful for going through and viewing logs and whatnot. Shared folders, you can share folders in this way. An extension of it is sharing folders between a VM and your actual computer. Local users and computers. I believe you can add additional users in that if I'm remembering that menu correctly. Performance monitor, similar to task manager. Disk management, again, very similar. This is going to be where you add disks and partition them. And then services and applications. So task scheduler, that allows you to schedule tasks that can either be run at specific times or whenever a condition is met. Event viewer, that allows us to view logs from the device. Typically, you might be viewing logs with this. A lot of times you're going to have them hopefully funneled off to what's called a SIM, a Security Information and Events Manager. That allows you to take a bunch of different logs from a bunch of different computers and servers, and you shove them all in one bucket, and then you can look through them and have different rule sets applied to them. So, Event Viewer, good to know how to use, and this is something that you will use a lot in incident response. So, just something to know about. Shared folders, that can be shared across the network and accessed by multiple users. Typically, you won't do anything with this. It's useful on servers mostly, more than anything. Local users and computers, so you can create users, and then add them to different built-in groups. So, for example, if you have a family computer and you want to make a different profile for someone else in your family to use, you can make a user for them in this, and you can make sure that they're not an administrator if you don't want them to be able to install things and things like that. Performance monitor monitors CPU usage and memory usage, etc. Disk management, again, mentioned this briefly. There's not a ton that you can do in this. You can manage your disks on your computer. You can create partitions, expand them, shrink them, and then format the partitions to use things like FAT32 in different ways that you can actually organize your computer. And then services and applications. It's possible to check the running services on the system, and then you have the ability to stop, start, or restart them. Let's talk about local security policy. Local security policy is a group of settings you can configure to strengthen the computer's security. Even though most policy settings in Windows are fine, there are a few that need adjusting for enhanced security. If you need to do this for a cyber defense club, you can find using the keyword search of Windows Basic Hardening Guide or Windows Cyber Defense Club Hardening Guide. That'll teach you how to do this. Very, very useful. You can set the minimum password length, the password complexity level, and you can disable guest and local administrator accounts, and so on and so forth. This is also really useful for if you are a defender right now watching this video, or you want to go into a defense role. Putting my pen tester hat on for a little bit. If you want to make my life really, really difficult, do the basics. Do things like this. This makes my life on a computer really, really not fun. If users are not local administrators, that makes my life a lot more difficult because I need to find some other different way to escalate. If whatever user I have from phishing, which is sending a malicious email to get access to a computer, is a local administrator, you made my life very easy. So just something to be aware of here. Note, if the computer is not integrated into an Active Directory environment, disabling local administrator account is a bad idea. Yeah, don't do this. Don't do that. You can't make changes if you disable your local administrator account. What I recommend doing is you can make yourself another administrator account, and you can just use that if you want to have it be your gaming computer or something like that, or it's just your personal computer, but don't disable your local one. Disk cleanup. Another useful utility is disk cleanup. So we can use that to delete files that are no longer needed by the system and are just adding to the computer disk space. Running disk cleanup as an administrator, we can also clean system files. Sometimes after getting updates, some files remain on the disk and are no longer needed. A lot of times Windows will just download things in the background while you're using the computer. If there's space available, it will try to do this so that restarting it and running updates is a lot quicker. If you run something like CCleaner, which isn't necessarily something I advise, just because you can get a lot of bloat with CCleaner, like programs you just don't want, disk cleanup will get all this as well. This is one of the utilities that I definitely recommend knowing how to use. So to access disk cleanup, right click on local disk C and then click properties. So if you go to File Explorer and then right click on local disk C, and then you'll see a general tab named, or a button in the general tab named disk cleanup. So here you can see a screenshot of the drive or C drive, and then you can see disk cleanup is right there. You need to tick the box /files you want to clean, and then you just press OK. Very useful. Definitely something that you can even go in and take a look at that after the fact of this video. Again, great for removing update files that don't really need to be there anymore. Registry editor or regedit. Okay, it looks like we do have two different versions of this. I believe one of these is specifically the command line version of it. The Windows registry database stores many important operating system settings. So, for example, it contains entries with information about what should happen when double-clicking a particular file type or how wide the taskbar should be. Built-in and inserted hardware also stores information in the registry when the driver is installed. This driver is called every time the system is booted up. So, the long and short of this, your registry has your settings. This is going to be what the Windows goes and looks at when it's saying, okay, what is your desktop background? Your desktop background is actually set in your registry and can be changed via group policy. And again, we'll go over that in just a little bit. To access the registry editor, you can either search it with Windows, the Windows key and R, and then you can type regedit. Windows key plus R brings up the run menu. You can run command line tools or just launch different things like that. Definitely worthwhile trying. Just run this right now and you can just see what pops up. Very cool. Command line tools. Windows comes equipped with 2 command line tools. So you have CMD, which is your actual command line. You have PowerShell, and then you have Windows Terminal. I'm not actually sure what the last one is. CMD is your standard command line interpreter for Windows operating system, and you shouldn't necessarily be using it. I recommend using PowerShell. CMD is great if you want to run just basic DOS commands. This is just basic Windows commands through it, but the PowerShell terminal is going to get you aliases of Linux commands, so you can run dir, ls, and things like that, and PowerShell will actually automatically recognize that, hey, I want to list the files in this specific part of my hard drive, or this specific folder, and it will interpret it to the Windows commands. Yeah, DOS is the general command line is great to use if that's all you have available. Otherwise, you should use PowerShell. So PowerShell is mainly used by sysadmins to manage the network in the domain they handle, as well as the computers and other devices that are part of it. PowerShell is a scripting language, and this is the proper spelling, by the way, with a capital S. So it's a scripting language, but it's also, you can bring up a PowerShell terminal. PowerShell can interpret bash commands and PowerShell commands, but the command prompt can only interpret bash commands. So PowerShell can do general commands and PowerShell. The command line cannot do PowerShell. It can only do commands. So something to be aware of. This is why you can change on Windows if you want to have it default to either having the command line or PowerShell pop up whenever you launch the terminal. That I recommend setting this to PowerShell. There's no reason to use the command line unless it's just all you have. It was referenced in the actual paragraph here. PowerShell you can do a lot of scripting with. There is a book called Learn PowerShell in a Month of Lunches. That's something that I've had recommended to me multiple times. I've read a fair amount of it, just enough to be dangerous with PowerShell, which is just about where I like to sit. That is something that if you are a system administrator and want to get better at learning PowerShell, definitely recommend checking that out. There is also a basic PowerShell room on TryHackMe as well. This is something that learning to use the scripting part of it is great. I recommend just getting used to basic PowerShell commands and just switching over to using this entirely because it's just infinitely more useful than the command line, or than the general command line rather. So both CMD and PowerShell are powerful command line tools used to automate system administration tasks by writing a script/batch file. However, CMD has limited administration capabilities as compared to PowerShell, which on the other hand is a bit more advanced, and modern shell implementation with additional features and enhancements. So you have commandlets. Those are more powerful commands. This is something that you'll learn about if you go further into PowerShell. Don't worry too much about that right now. Let's talk about the Windows Terminal. The Windows Terminal can be used instead of PowerShell and CMD and can be installed from the Microsoft Store. Okay, yep, this is the new one rather. The Windows Terminal, this is an experimental thing that I don't think is standard yet with Windows. It allows for multiple tab support, additional themes and whatnot, and you can tweak your terminal and how it looks like. This is what I actually use on my main computer. It is significantly nicer than using either just standard PowerShell or CMD. Having tabs is really, really nice, especially when you're doing one thing and you need additional tab open just to check something, and you can hop between them pretty quickly. Nice thing with the Windows Terminal, it also supports having tabs open and launching Windows subsystem for Linux, WSL2 in this. So you can launch Linux tabs and just have it as another tab in the Windows Terminal. Definitely recommend checking out. This is something that Microsoft introduced, I want to say, a year and a half ago as of the recording of this video. If you can switch to this, it's really nice. Otherwise, at least put on PowerShell as your default editor, or default command line rather. Let's talk about the other registry editor. So the registry editor can be considered a database that contains low-level settings for Microsoft Windows settings and applications. So the registries, the 5 places where your computer has different settings are as follows. You have HKey current or classes root, HKey current user. This is your settings for whatever user you are logged in as. HKey local machine settings. HKey users. And then HKey current config. So this is your actual computer configuration in there. Current user is one of the more interesting ones. These are all really interesting though, and definitely recommend learning a little bit more about each one of them. And you can see that here, your registry hives. These are specifically referred to as the hives. A feature of PowerShell is that you can browse the registries. You can do that by CD and then the registry DB. So, for example, you can CD to HKLM, that is HKey local machine. They're all shortened on PowerShell. Windows also has a built-in tool named Reg, which can be used from the command line to add, remove, query, import, export, and so on and so forth for registry keys. Very useful. This is really, really nice for scripting. If you want to do basic scripting. Otherwise, PowerShell can also interact with your registry. As I mentioned, Windows settings are in the registry. You can do that if, for example, every person in your company, you want to change their desktop background to be the company logo, like a specific background, and you don't want them to be able to change that. You can do that via a PowerShell script that'll change that setting for everyone. Very, very nice, very easy. Ideally, you want to do that with GPO. Again, group policy objects, but you can do it with, there are multiple ways to do things in Windows in that regard. There's also an available GUI that you can use. So again, you just type regedit. That is what we were talking about all the way up here, that you can take a look and just scroll through the different folders. Definitely worthwhile taking a look at, not necessarily something that you need to do. This is useful to know for when you want to start dumping passwords and you have access to different parts of the Windows computer. There is no point to remember the paths for some settings that are located in the registry header. Whenever you need to make changes to the registry, you'll memorize these as you use it. Typically, you're just going to be Googling it, though. Microsoft's documentation on the registry is okay. You can find things as you need them. Usually, Stack Overflow is going to be your friend there. So we'll go ahead and mark that as complete and jump into task 5, types of servers. What is a server? A server is a piece of hardware or software equipment that provides functionality for other software or devices. It is a server. It serves content or serves something. So types of servers. These are types of servers traditionally found within a Windows environment or just a traditional company network. Servers can be used for a variety of actions or things. Some of the most common ones are you have your domain controller. We talked about this a little bit. It actually is what handles authentication and other things on the domain. You have a file server, which can be just a generic file share that maybe you have a company share drive that you can use for transferring files. Hopefully that's audited, because otherwise usually there are passwords on that. You have web servers. That's what THM runs on. That is going to be just a server that is dedicated to running part of a website or all of a website. FTP server, that's a file transfer server. Mail server, that's going to be what Outlook or Google Drive or Google Gmail rather runs off of. Database server, this is typically going to be used in conjunction with an application or a web server. A proxy server is typically going to sit in front of the web server so that you can handle attacks and whatnot that are coming in. And then an application server, this would be something like Citrix. All right, so types of servers, we can see a generic diagram down here. Application servers typically are just something that is going to run sort of application for the network. And I've already talked about this quite a bit. You can go through this if you want an additional, some additional information per different server type. But otherwise, we'll skip into the questions. We'll go ahead and mark that as completed for the first one. What can be considered the most important server? This should be the domain controller. And then which server can store emails? That's going to be the mail server. Let's jump into task 6, users and groups management. So users and groups management in Active Directory. I'm going to go ahead and press deploy on this. We'll let that spin up. And then I'm going to go ahead and also start my attack box. We'll take a look at that in a moment. So deploy the machine and authenticate using RDP on Windows or Ramina. We'll use Ramina in this case with the user administrator, and then TryHackMe 123 exclamation point. We'll go ahead and read through this, and then we'll go back through and take a look by RDPing in there. In Active Directory, user management is done using the Active Directory Users and Computers application. This is often shortened to ADOC. Most system administrators will just call it that. It is a very recognizable icon. It looks like a stack of post-it notes if I remember correctly, and we'll take a look at it in a moment. To access it, go to Tools, Active Directory, Users, and Computers. So this is from Server Manager. This is what pops up when a server first starts for a Windows server. And you can see in Tools, we have Active Directory, Users, and Computers right there. We'll take a look at it in a moment once it's all started up. Before any other action, let's enable Advanced Features, which adds additional features when looking at object properties. This is doable by going to View and then Advanced Features. So we'll do that in a moment. By double-clicking on the thm.lab, this is going to be a domain. We are presented with the Active Directory tree. So we can see that expand out below. Let's create an organizational unit, an OU. Think of this as just a folder where we can store users and computers or additional OUs. Think of it as a folder where users are your data or your files. You can check them in anywhere, and you can put different permissions on different folders to make different groups and whatnot. Or you can just give different permissions in that way. To do that, right-click on the domain name, so thm.lab. We can click on it right here, and or right-click on it rather, and then go to New, and then Organizational Unit right here. I named it Lab, and then click on OK to create it. And we'll walk through this in just a moment. Let's create two more OUs inside the newly created OU. It will look nested in this specific case. All right, let's go ahead, see if our Windows server is up. It is. We'll go to Applications, Ramina, maybe. We'll just pull it up with this. We can hit cancel on that. So when it prompts you for a password in this, you don't actually need it. And we'll press enter on that. We're going to do RDP 10, 10, 104, 243. Hit enter. We're going to accept the certificate, if I can drag it over. And then we will log in with the username administrator, and then TryHackMe123 exclamation point. And we're just logging in as the local administrator. We'll give it a moment. And I need to change it to, hold on. We will adjust our settings real quick, if I can find it. No, I don't want anonymous statistics. I will go and pause this. I need to change a quick setting on this, and then we'll be right back. All right, we are back. I'm going to show you guys this real quick because you'll probably have the same issue as me. Let's go ahead and drag this over. I will close that. So I have gone in here, and I will copy that, and then we'll click the plus button over here. So this is going to bring up the settings that we can use per connection. In this specific case, I can paste that here. Maybe it's going to play ball. We'll go and put that in here. 104, 243. Username administrator, and then TryHackMe123 exclamation point. And then we want to change the actual color depth here. I actually grabbed this setting from the Advent of Cyber 2 room. We want to change it to Remote FX 32BPP, and then we'll go ahead and do Save and Connect. There we go. So we have to adjust our color profile. Otherwise, the machine just gets upset, as we need to be using a compatible setting with it. So let's go ahead. I will let this load. Then we're going to go and open up ADUC, and we'll take a look at adding our own OUs. So this will take just a moment. This is just a normal Windows login. This, since we're logging into the network with RDP, it does take a little bit longer because it needs to fetch it, and Windows servers are traditionally just kind of chunky with loading. They take a while, so just be aware. We'll give it a second here, and I think we just don't have a background due to our color profile. Maybe. Yeah, it's still loading. Let's take a look at what else we want to do. So we're going to go ahead and make another OU, and then we can go ahead and create a couple more groups there. So you can make a couple more OUs inside of it, and just name them whatever you want. And then if you right click on inside of an OU, you can actually create a user or an object in there. But in this specific case, we can do right click, new, and then user, and we'll be presented with this prompt. Hopefully at some point if this ever loads. It's really not enjoying me at this moment. Sometimes things like this just happen. So in this specific case, this is if we wanted to make a new user on our domain thm.lab. Here you can see that we can fill out information about that user, Albert Einstein in this case, set their login name right here. This is usually automatically generated. However, you can change this. Then we're going to go ahead and set our password, and then we can also change a couple properties with this account. So, for example, we can make it so that they can't change their password. We'll move this over, go to Tools, maybe. Just thinking about it. We'll give it a moment. So, for example, we don't want them to be able to change their password. We can set that here, and we can also set that a password never expires. The password never expires bit is super useful if you're setting up a lab or things like that. So if we go to Tools, maybe. Just thinking about it. Windows servers are RAM hogs, and you can see it right here. That when they have very little RAM, they get very, very upset. Unlike Linux, they just don't appreciate it. So we'll let that launch. The reason I checked password never expire is I do not want the password to expire after a period of time. The default password expiration time in Active Directory is 42 days. I guarantee you, if you were taking an IT class, this will be a question on one of your exams. You should know this. Not for any other reason. It's just something that will come up as an IT class question, especially if you're taking, I believe this will come up with your A+ if you're taking that. In a production environment, you could probably check user must change password at next login or logon. This is what you would do if you're making a new user for someone that maybe has just joined your company. You can create a user for them, give them a temporary password, and then have them change their password right after the login. Since the password cannot be set to expire after, or can be set to expire after a period of time, it would be a bad idea to check the user cannot change password. So, for example, if it could expire, but they can't change their password, if their password expires, they can't log in anymore, and you need to go through and actually, do something about that. And here we can see that ADOC is loaded for me. And if we click on this, we can see the AD tree will load. And I'll make an ODU in this case. And you can see that in our demo over here on the side, we've successfully created our new AD user. In this case, they're making a couple more users, and you can just name them whatever you want. So if I want to make a new OU, I would right click on this. Maybe. It's thinking about it. Windows, oh, you're trying. New, and then organizational unit. And I can name this lab. We'll just follow the example in this case. Typically, you just want to leave that protect container from accidental deletion checked. And then over here in the side, we can make more new things. So if you want to add a computer, a contact, you can make templates, you can do all sorts of useful things. When you start learning about Active Directory, if you are going into general IT, this is something that you will cover. So let's go ahead and we'll take a look at the user menu. Here we can actually just fill in that data. In this case, I'm just going to make another OU to show that we can actually, make more OUs in the OU that we created. Maybe, if Windows lets me. Okay, Windows is not playing ball. Regardless, you can see it's very easy to create users in this. Creating users for a server or a domain environment is pretty easy. Typically, you will create a template if you're doing this on a large scale, and you'll have this probably scripted out. Very, very simple. Here we can see that we are creating a type of group for our users in our demo. Let's move to the groups OU and then right click on OU, new, and then group. So we can add a new group here. In this case, we're going to name it admins, and it will be a global group. You don't need to know what these do right now. This is something you will learn in an Active Directory class. Group types, very simple. Security group means permissions. Distribution means mailing group, mailing list, things like that. So we want to do security group because we are going to grant them, we would apply permissions in that case. We can create another group as per our demo over here that would be named just RDP access. So if we wanted to grant RDP access to a set group of people, we can do that. We can also explicitly say that, hey, we're going to block users or a group of users that we really don't like, or shouldn't be able to use RDP. And we can put them in a group called no RDP access. Nice and simple. And we can see those created groups over here. To assign a user to a group, you can do that two ways. You can either add the user into the group from the user, or you can go to the group and then you can add users. And we'll see that over here. So we can go to a user and then we can go to add to a group right there. And then it'll show this little dialog. And then we can, it'll show a different dialog in this specific case. And we can actually add them into different groups in that case. It'll just be a very simple dialog box that lets us type in group names. We can also double click on a group and then we can go to the members tab and then click add. Very, very simple. And in this specific case, you can see that we're adding it via the group menu right here. So if we go to add, we can search for things here. You can type something down here and then you click check names and it will check to make sure that you've spelled it correctly. If it comes back underlined, it means that the domain has actually found your object and that you are adding something to the group. Otherwise, if you click OK, it's going to do a whole lot of nothing. And then we can proceed to add users to other groups. Very, very simple, very easy. And in this case, you can see that we can add users to groups in a very trivial manner. Perfect. This is something that I do recommend playing around with a little bit. Be patient with the VM. It looks like it's being a little chunky. So just be aware of that. We'll go ahead and mark that as completed. And we'll move into our last task. And I'm going to go ahead and minimize this. And we'll go into task 7, creating your first GPO. So I referenced this a couple times throughout this room. GPOs are super useful on a domain side of things. We can use them to set policies or restrictions or different things that we want throughout the domain. So what are group policy objects? A GPO, or a group policy object, is a feature of Active Directory that adds additional controls to user accounts and computers. Group policy settings include local settings, site-wide settings, domain-level settings, and settings applied to organizational units. Again, think folder when you see that. Creating our first GPO. In this case, I'm just going to walk through it using the demo that's provided, since it shows the same thing that I'd be doing anyways. So to create a GPO, we need to go to Tools. Again, this is in our server manager that pops up when the server starts, when we log in, and then we can click Group Policy Management. So just a little bit down there. Right-click on Group Policy Objects and create a new object. So for example, we can go to Group Policy Objects, right-click on that, and then we can select Create New Object. In this case, we can see that we have our object down here named Groups GPO. To edit that, we can right-click on it and then click this Edit button. For the purpose of this demo, we will set different permissions for the groups recently created. First, let's let users, say that 10 times fast, authenticate using RDP. So to do so, go to Policies, Windows Settings, Security Settings, and then Local Policies, Users Right Assignments. This is just drilling down into these folders that will pop up when you were looking at GPO. This is how we actually set the permissions on the groups that we've created, by the way. And then double click on Allow Login or Log On through Remote Desktop Services. So when you've selected the actual object that you want to modify in here, or the actual item rather that you want to modify, you'll see the policies jump up on the right-hand side. This you can see that not defined means that it's going to be at the default setting, which in the case of RDP is disallow, but allow for administrators, I believe. And then when we actually define that, it'll say defined and then the actual setting over there. So select define these policy settings, add user or group, and then click browse. So if we want to go into that, we can see that add user or group, we can type in the username and then click browse. And then similar to the adding a user to a group, this will show results to our search. And we can, hold on, kitten right below me, trying to get adventurous. We can select the actual users and groups that we want to add accordingly in there. In this case, we want to search for admins and RDP access groups, and then we'll go ahead and add them. So we can do that here, and then we can, again, click check names. Note this is separated with the semicolon right here, and then check names will verify that we spelled everything correctly. We can hit OK, and that'll add them to allow that policy. To block a user or a group to log in using RDP, we can do that by double-clicking Deny Logon So again, here in the user rights assignment, there's another setting that we can click if we want to block them from being able to use RDP. And we can do that in the same way that we saw above. We can close the editor and go back to our group policy management console after we've done this. In order to make the policy apply, we have to link the GPO to the root of the domain. To do that, right-click on the domain controller's OU. So again, if we go back in here, this is in ADUC, or this is in group policy rather. If we go to here, we can right-click on the domain controllers, and then we can link or click on Link at Existing GPO and select the GPO that we've created. In this case, it's going to be the group's GPO right there, and then we just press OK, and that's it. So to apply the GPO, open a command prompt. So just any command prompt, you could do this in PowerShell as well, of course, and then click Run as Administrator. So you want to right-click on it and make sure that it is running with administrator permissions. Then you can type the command gp update and then space /force. That is going to force the computer to fetch the latest group policy that has been applied to it, and then it will update accordingly. This will be done naturally as well, but GP update can be a great way to actually force something to go through for the sake of testing. Testing the GPO. Here we can see that the GPO, should we have applied it correctly and specified it correctly in the steps before, we can see that the different rights have applied. In this case, we have a couple users that can actually RDP in, and then some users that won't be able to RDP in. For the sake of just going through the room, I'm not going to bother with going through and testing that. I would recommend going through and you can confirm it. However, it's pretty straightforward. If this is the first time that you've played around with GPO, I do recommend testing this out just to confirm that you did it correctly. All right, and then in this specific case, we can see that we're attempting to do RDP access. It's going to ask for credentials because our user can't actually do this. And we can enter in our admin credentials if we wanted to, but for the sake of this demonstration, if we were the user in question, that user wouldn't be able to log in and they wouldn't be able to do anything at this point. So that verifies that it works. Note, you can spawn a shell if you use an administrator credential, in your case, Albert Einstein. In this case, it looks like they're just trying to run the Windows command prompt as a user that's logged in. Let's see. Lastly, try logging into an account with no RDP access. You can see that, again, it doesn't work because, well, we are using RDP to access the server, and that user can't actually use RDP. So very straightforward. Again, this is just testing that the GPO that we've actually created works and that non-administrative users cannot perform administrative actions such as installing software or, launching administrative command prompts. So again, verifying that that works. I do recommend going through, and if you've never done this before, go create your first GPO and play around with it just a little bit. Otherwise, that is going to do it for this room. If you have any questions, I will have the TryHackMe Discord linked in the description as always, along with the DarkSec Discord. If you enjoyed this content, definitely subscribe, like the video, and then follow me on Twitter. Otherwise, until next time, happy hacking.